Elia had always believed that her marriage to Robert was built on something rare and unbreakable: trust. For years, she had lived with the quiet confidence that the man she shared her life with truly loved her. Robert had entered her life at a time when her career was rising quickly. She had built a successful investment business, purchased several properties, and secured financial stability long before she ever walked down the aisle. But none of that had seemed to matter to Robert. At least, that was what Elia believed. He had always told her the same thing whenever the subject of money appeared between them. "I married you, not your money," Robert would say with a warm smile. And Elia believed him. Robert was attentive in ways that made her feel safe. He celebrated her achievements, praised her discipline, and often told friends how proud he was of the woman he married. When they attended gatherings together, people would often comment on how perfect they looked as a couple: a successful woman and a devoted husband, a beautiful home, a life that appeared stable and full of promise. But sometimes perfection hides something darker beneath the surface. The night everything changed began like any ordinary evening. Elia had returned home later than usual after attending a business dinner. The house was quiet except for the soft glow of the living room lights. Robert had told her earlier that he would be working from home that night, so she assumed he was somewhere inside the house finishing his tasks. As she stepped inside, she noticed his voice coming faintly from the study room. He was on the phone. At first, Elia paid no attention. Robert often handled business calls in private, and she respected that boundary. She placed her bag quietly on the hallway table and walked toward the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. But something about Robert's voice made her pause. His tone was different. It wasn't the relaxed, warm voice she knew. Instead, it sounded low, controlled, almost mechanical. Curiosity made her stop near the hallway leading to the study. The door was slightly open, and Robert was standing with his back turned, speaking into his phone. Elia wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the words she heard next froze her where she stood. "Don't worry," Robert said calmly. "Once she's gone, everything automatically transfers to me." Elia felt her heartbeat stumble. Gone. Her fingers tightened around the glass in her hand. The voice on the other end of the phone was too faint to hear clearly, but Robert continued speaking in the same cold, composed tone. "No one will question it," he said. "Accidents happen all the time." Elia's breath caught in her throat. Her mind tried to reject what she was hearing. Maybe he wasn't talking about her. Maybe it was about business. Maybe she misunderstood. But Robert continued, "The insurance alone is worth it. And the house, the investments, it all becomes mine once the paperwork clears." The glass in Elia's hand trembled slightly. She felt the ground beneath her shift in a way she had never experienced before. Robert wasn't speaking about a business deal. He was speaking about her. "Relax," Robert added with a quiet chuckle. "She trusts me completely." Those words cut deeper than anything else. Elia slowly stepped back, careful not to make a sound. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was afraid he might hear it through the walls. The man she loved was calmly discussing a future where she no longer existed. A future he clearly wanted. She walked upstairs in silence, her mind racing with thoughts she could barely control. Every memory of their marriage suddenly felt uncertain. Had Robert always been like this? Had every smile been an act? Had every kind word been a lie? That night, Elia didn't sleep. She sat alone in the dark bedroom, staring at the ceiling while Robert eventually joined her hours later. He slid into bed beside her as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just discussed her death like a financial transaction. Elia kept her breathing steady, pretending to sleep, but inside, something had changed forever. The next morning, she began thinking clearly. Confronting Robert was impossible. If he truly intended to harm her, accusing him would only make him more dangerous. She had no evidence except the conversation she overheard, and Robert was patient, calculating. He would simply deny everything and wait for another opportunity. Elia realized she only had one real advantage. Robert believed she trusted him, and she intended to use that. Over the next several days, Elia began quietly preparing a plan. If Robert believed her death would give him everything, then she would let him believe that moment had already happened. The idea sounded insane at first, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. If she disappeared on her own terms, Robert would reveal his true intentions. And more importantly, she would still be alive to protect herself. With the help of careful planning, forged documentation, and staged evidence, Elia began constructing the illusion of a tragic accident. Her car would appear to have been involved in a fatal crash outside the city. The records would show severe damage and fire. Identification would rely on documents found inside the vehicle. The rest would be handled by paperwork. The most important piece was the death certificate. Once the document existed, Robert would believe the opportunity he had been waiting for had arrived. And Elia would finally see the truth. The day everything was set in motion felt strangely quiet. Elia watched from a distance as the official-looking documents were delivered to their house. Her heart beat slowly as she stood inside a parked car across the street. She wore a hat and dark glasses, keeping her face hidden. Inside the house, Robert answered the door. The courier handed him the envelope. Elia could see Robert's posture change slightly as he opened it. For a few seconds, his face looked stunned. Elia held her breath. She needed to see grief. Even if it was fake. Even if it lasted only a moment. But something else happened instead. Robert read the document slowly. Then his lips curled upward. It wasn't a smile of shock. It wasn't a smile of disbelief. It was a smile of satisfaction. A quiet, relieved smile. Robert looked around briefly, as if making sure no one was watching. Then he exhaled slowly, almost like a man who had just received very good news. Elia felt the air leave her lungs. There were no tears, no sadness, no confusion, only relief. In that moment, every doubt disappeared. Robert had truly been waiting for this. The man she married had been patiently anticipating the day she would die. Elia sat motionless in the car for several minutes, staring at the house that had once been her safe place. A strange calm slowly replaced the shock in her chest. She now understood something important. She hadn't just saved her life. She had uncovered the truth. Robert believed she was gone. He believed his plan had succeeded without him even needing to act. And that belief would make him careless. Elia started the engine of the car and drove away quietly, leaving the house behind. Her marriage was over, but the real story had only just begun. Because Robert had made one fatal mistake. He believed his wife was dead, and that belief would soon cost him everything. Now officially dead, Elia had the advantage of something most people could never imagine: complete invisibility. In the eyes of the law, the neighbors, and even her own husband, she no longer existed. Her name had already been spoken in past tense. Her life had been reduced to a tragic accident reported in quiet whispers. Robert had already begun preparing his next steps, confident that her assets would soon become his. But Elia moved faster. She knew exactly what Robert would try to do next. Once the legal process of her death moved forward, he would begin gathering every document related to her properties and investments. Those papers would allow him to claim ownership legally. Unfortunately for him, most of those documents were still inside the house. The luxurious house Elia had purchased years before she ever met Robert. The house Robert was now living in as if it already belonged to him. Inside that house were the keys to everything: property ownership certificates, investment agreements, bank authorizations, insurance contracts, and legal records proving that Elia still controlled every asset connected to her name. If Robert managed to secure those documents first, things could become complicated. But Elia had no intention of giving him that chance. 2 days after the fake death certificate had been delivered, she parked her car several streets away from the house and quietly observed the morning routine she knew so well. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Robert walked out of the front door wearing a dark suit and carrying his briefcase. He locked the door behind him and drove away without hesitation. Elia watched the car disappear at the end of the street. Her window of opportunity had begun. She opened the back seat of her car and reached for the uniform she had prepared. A gray technician's shirt, dark work pants, a simple maintenance cap. The disguise was deliberately ordinary, something no one would remember looking at twice. She tied her hair tightly under the cap, put on thin gloves, and slipped a mask over the lower half of her face. Anyone who saw her would assume she was just another technician sent for routine service. Beside her on the seat was a metal toolbox filled with tools she had purchased that morning. Most of them she didn't even know how to use. But they didn't need to work. They only needed to look convincing. Elia checked the fake service documents she had printed earlier. The papers looked official enough to pass a quick glance. Taking a slow breath, she stepped out of the car. As she walked down the familiar street, her heart beat steadily but calmly. Fear had been replaced by something sharper now, focus. When she reached the gate of the property, the sight of the house stirred a strange wave of emotion inside her. This had once been her sanctuary. Now she was approaching it like a stranger. The tall gate opened easily using the spare access card she had kept hidden long before everything began. Robert had never known it existed. Elia stepped inside the property. The garden looked exactly the same. The trimmed hedges, the stone walkway, the quiet fountain near the entrance. Everything remained untouched. It was as if the house itself had no idea its owner had supposedly died. Elia walked to the front door and rang the bell once, just to maintain the illusion of a routine service call. No answer. Of course there wouldn't be. Robert was already at work. After waiting a few seconds, she unlocked the door with the spare key she had quietly taken before staging the accident. The door opened slowly. Elia stepped inside. The air inside the house felt heavy with silence. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting her eyes scan the living room. The furniture was exactly where she had left it. The paintings on the wall remained untouched. But something had changed. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like enemy territory. Elia closed the door behind her and immediately began moving with purpose. Her first stop was the hallway closet where Robert kept maintenance records for the house. She opened the cabinet and pulled out the air conditioning panel, pretending to check the system in case any neighbor happened to glance through the windows. The act gave her a believable reason to be inside, but her real destination was upstairs. She climbed the staircase slowly, every step echoing faintly in the quiet house. Each room she passed carried memories she didn't have time to feel. The bedroom where she once slept beside Robert. The small office where she managed her business accounts. The reading corner near the window where she used to spend quiet mornings. All of it felt distant now. Elia walked straight toward the study room. She knew exactly what was inside. Robert believed the safe in that room contained documents he would soon inherit. He had never realized those documents were still legally under Elia's control. The door to the study creaked softly as she opened it. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the familiar desk and shelves filled with files. Elia locked the door behind her. Then she moved directly toward the wall cabinet. Inside it was a small digital safe hidden behind a row of legal folders. Robert thought he was the only one who knew the code. But Elia had watched him enter dozens of times. Her fingers moved quickly across the keypad. 4 numbers. A quiet click. The safe opened. Inside were the documents she had come for. Property titles, investment certificates, bank authorization letters, insurance agreements. Everything Robert believed would soon belong to him. Elia carefully removed each file and placed them inside her technician bag. Her hands moved quickly but methodically. She double-checked every document, making sure nothing important was left behind. The stack of papers grew thicker with each passing minute. With every document she secured, Robert's future collapsed a little more. When the safe was finally empty, Elia closed it again and returned the cabinet exactly as it had been. To anyone else, nothing would look disturbed. She then spent several minutes walking through the house again, maintaining the illusion of an air conditioning inspection. She opened vents, adjusted panels, tapped tools against the metal casing. Anyone watching from outside would simply see a technician doing her job. Finally, Elia returned to the living room. She paused there for a moment. This house had once been the center of her life. Now it was just another asset she was about to take back. Elia picked up her toolbox and walked toward the door. The sunlight outside felt brighter as she stepped through the entrance again. She closed the gate behind her calmly and walked down the street without looking back. To anyone watching, she was just a technician finishing a routine service call. But inside her bag were the documents that controlled millions in assets. And Robert had no idea they were already gone. As Elia reached her car and placed the bag carefully on the passenger seat, a quiet sense of control settled over her. The first phase of her plan had worked perfectly, but the real shock for Robert was still coming, and he would never see it coming from a wife he believed was already dead. The moment Elia drove away from the house with the technician bag resting beside her, she knew the balance of power had shifted. Inside that bag were not just papers. They were control. They were protection. They were the difference between losing everything and taking it all back. But the job was not finished yet. Elia drove calmly through the city, careful not to attract attention. The morning traffic moved steadily around her, people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that a woman who had officially died 2 days earlier was driving among them. After several turns, she parked inside the underground lot of a quiet office building she had once used for business meetings. No one here would question her presence. She took the bag and walked quickly toward a small private office she had rented months ago as a backup workspace. It was a precaution she had taken long before Robert ever knew about it. Today, that precaution was saving her future. Once inside, Elia locked the door and placed the bag carefully on the desk. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Everything Robert thought he would soon own was sitting inside that bag. Elia slowly opened it. One by one, she removed the documents. The property ownership certificate for the house. The legal investment portfolios tied to her name. Bank account authorizations. Insurance contracts. Corporate share certificates. Every major asset she owned was documented in those files. If Robert had obtained them first, he could have begun the process of transferring everything into his name once the legal confirmation of her death was finalized. But now he couldn't, because the only person who could authorize those transfers was still alive. Elia sat down and began reviewing each document carefully. Her mind moved quickly, calculating the next steps. The house was the most urgent issue. Robert was already living there, confident that it would soon belong to him. If he began contacting lawyers or banks, questions might arise. Elia needed to act before he did. She reached for her phone and opened a contact she had not used in months. Daniel Hartman, a discreet property lawyer she had trusted for years. She hesitated for a moment before dialing. Daniel answered after the third ring. "Elia," he said, sounding surprised. "I thought you were dead." Elia finished calmly. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice lowering. "What exactly is going on?" "I'll explain later," Elia said. "Right now I need your help." Another pause. "You're serious," Daniel said quietly. "Yes." "What do you need?" Elia glanced at the stack of documents spread across the desk. "I need to sell the house," she said. "The main property?" "Yes." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Elia, according to public records, you're deceased." "I know. And Robert is likely preparing inheritance claims." "I know that too." "Then selling the house could trigger serious complications." "Not if we move quickly," Elia replied. Daniel remained silent for several seconds, thinking. Finally he spoke. "If the ownership documentation is still under your legal authority, and if the transfer is executed before any inheritance claims are finalized, it could work." Elia allowed herself a small smile. That's exactly what I was thinking. Daniel sighed. You always did like dangerous strategies. Only when necessary. All right, he said. Bring the documents to my office. We'll start the process today. Elia ended the call and looked down at the papers again. Step 1 had already succeeded. Now the real damage would begin. Over the next several hours, Elia moved with precise determination. She met Daniel privately and explained just enough of the situation for him to understand the urgency. The details of Robert's betrayal could wait. What mattered now was speed. Legal documents were prepared. Ownership verification was confirmed. A discreet buyer was contacted, someone who had previously expressed interest in purchasing the property. The buyer moved quickly once the opportunity appeared. Within 2 days, the transaction was completed. The luxurious house that Robert believed he would soon inherit had already been sold. The legal transfer was executed quietly, and the funds were secured safely under Elia's direct control. But Elia wasn't finished yet, because she knew Robert still believed he was winning. 3 days after the house sale was finalized, Elia returned to the neighborhood. This time she wore simple clothes, nothing that would attract attention. Her hair was tucked under a plain hat, and dark glasses hid most of her face. She stood across the street, partially hidden behind the tall fence of an empty property. From there, she could see the house clearly. Robert's car was parked in the driveway. He had returned home from work. Elia watched him through the gate as he walked inside the house confidently, unaware that the ground beneath his life had already shifted. A few minutes passed. Then another car arrived. 2 men stepped out. They were dressed in formal business suits. Elia recognized the logo on the folder one of them carried. Bank officers. They walked directly toward the gate and rang the bell. Robert opened the door. From where she stood, Elia couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see Robert's expression change almost immediately. Confusion, then disbelief. The bank officer handed him a document. Robert read it quickly. His posture stiffened. He began speaking rapidly, his gestures growing sharper. The officers remained calm. One of them pointed toward the house. Another document was presented. Robert shook his head violently. Elia could see the panic spreading across his face. The man who had smiled at the news of her death now looked like someone who had just realized everything was slipping away. Robert stepped outside the gate, raising his voice. The officers remained composed. One of them simply pointed again to the official papers. The house had been legally sold. Ownership had already changed. Financial enforcement procedures were beginning, and Robert had absolutely no control over it. From behind the fence, Elia watched the entire scene unfold. A strange calm settled inside her chest. Not joy, not revenge, just clarity. The man she once trusted with her life had been ready to destroy her for money. Now he was facing the consequences of that greed. Robert ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth as he argued with the officers. But the documents didn't lie, and the law didn't care about his plans. Elia slowly removed her glasses and watched him a little longer. 3 days ago, Robert believed he had won. He thought fate had removed the only obstacle between him and wealth. But fate had done something very different. It had revealed who he truly was. Elia placed her glasses back on and turned away from the house. The documents were safe. The assets were secure. And the man who once called himself her husband was finally seeing the consequences of his own betrayal. As she walked down the quiet street, disappearing into the late afternoon crowd, Elia felt something she hadn't felt since the night she overheard Robert's plan. Freedom, because everything that had almost been stolen from her had just been taken back. But Elia knew one thing clearly. Robert still didn't understand what was happening. From where she stood across the street that afternoon, she could see confusion written across his face as he argued with the 2 bank officers at the gate. His movements were restless, his hands cutting through the air as he spoke with growing frustration. Robert had always believed he was the smartest person in the room. But now, for the first time, he was standing in a situation he couldn't control. Inside the envelope the bank officer had given him was a document that changed everything. The property he believed would soon belong to him had already been sold, and the new ownership had triggered a series of financial procedures he had never expected. Elia watched him closely. Robert reread the paper several times, shaking his head in disbelief. His voice grew louder, his words sharper. He was demanding explanations, but the two officers remained calm. They were professionals who had handled situations like this many times before. One of them spoke slowly, pointing at the legal documents again. The property ownership had already been transferred through a valid sale. The financial structure attached to the house, loans, contracts, and guarantees had also been updated. The new owners were exercising their rights, and the bank was enforcing the terms connected to the property. Robert's shoulders stiffened as the truth slowly began to sink in. "This house belongs to my wife," he insisted, his voice rising. The officer responded quietly, "According to these records, your wife was the legal owner, and the property has already been sold." Robert froze. Elia could see the exact moment the statement struck him. Sold? The word clearly didn't fit the reality he had imagined. Robert had been waiting for the official inheritance process to complete. Once the death certificate was processed and the estate transferred, everything Elia owned would move under his control. That was the plan. That was the future he had already pictured. But someone had moved faster. Robert began pacing near the gate, running his hand through his hair as if trying to reorganize the chaos forming inside his mind. "How can it be sold?" he demanded. "She's dead." One of the officers opened another document and showed him a section near the bottom. Elia couldn't hear the exact words, but she could see Robert's expression change again. Shock. The ownership transfer had been signed and authorized before the estate process had even begun. Legally, cleanly, irreversibly. Robert stared at the paper for several seconds as if hoping the words might change if he looked long enough. But they didn't. Behind the iron fence across the street, Elia remained perfectly still. A gentle breeze moved through the trees above her, rustling the leaves quietly. She felt no triumph, no anger, only a deep, quiet understanding of what this moment meant. Robert had believed he was playing the long game. He thought patience and manipulation would eventually hand him everything she owned. But he had never considered the possibility that the person he was trying to destroy might already be several steps ahead. The officers spoke again, pointing toward the house. It appeared they were explaining the next stage of the process. Robert's face darkened as he listened. His voice grew louder again, more desperate now. "This is impossible," he shouted. One of the officers remained composed. "Sir, the transaction has already been completed. The new ownership has been registered." Robert shook his head violently. "This house belongs to me." The officer calmly repeated the same answer. "It no longer does." The words landed heavily in the quiet street. For a long moment, Robert simply stood there, staring at the documents in his hands as if they had betrayed him personally. Elia studied him carefully. This was the same man who had smiled when he believed she was dead. The same man who had calmly discussed her disappearance as a financial opportunity. Now that opportunity had collapsed, and he had absolutely no idea how. Robert stepped away from the officers and walked toward the driveway, looking around the property as if seeing it for the first time. The large windows, the marble entrance, the garden he had barely paid attention to for years. Everything suddenly looked different, because none of it belonged to him. The officers followed him slowly, continuing to explain the legal consequences that would soon follow. The financial claims tied to the property would now require immediate resolution, and Robert had no legal authority to stop it. Elia could see his frustration turning into something deeper. Fear. Not fear of losing the house, but fear of not understanding how the situation had changed so quickly. Robert turned back toward the officers again. "Who sold it?" he demanded. The officer glanced at the document again before answering. "The legal owner." Robert stared at him. "But she's dead." The officer simply lifted his shoulders, slightly. The documentation we received was valid. That answer clearly gave Robert no comfort. He looked down at the papers again, flipping through the pages as if searching for some hidden explanation. But there was none. Elia had planned everything too carefully. Every step had been executed before Robert even realized he needed to act. The house had already changed hands. The money had already moved. And the evidence connecting her to the transaction had been handled through layers of legal protection. Robert stood there for several long seconds, completely silent. Then suddenly he laughed. It was a short, sharp sound filled with disbelief. "This has to be a mistake," he said. But even he didn't sound convinced. Across the street, Elia watched him closely. This moment wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. The truth about the man she had married. Robert wasn't grieving a lost wife. He was grieving a lost fortune. And that realization settled something inside her. Elia slowly stepped away from the fence. She had seen enough. As she walked down the quiet sidewalk, she could still hear Robert's voice rising behind her as he argued with the officers again. But his anger no longer mattered, because the house was no longer part of his life. And neither was she. The street gradually grew busier as Elia approached the corner. Cars passed. People walked by. Life continued normally. No one noticed the woman moving calmly through the crowd. No one recognized the woman who had supposedly died in a tragic accident just days earlier. Elia adjusted her glasses slightly and continued walking. For the first time since everything began, she felt the weight of the past few days lifting from her shoulders. Robert had tried to erase her existence. Instead, he had revealed his own. And the future he thought he had secured had vanished before he even realized it was slipping away. Behind her, the house that once held her marriage was becoming nothing more than a memory. And ahead of her was something far more valuable. A life that belonged entirely to her again. Elia walked slowly down the quiet street, her steps steady, her breathing calm. Behind her, Robert's voice still echoed faintly as he argued with the bank officers. His frustration carried through the air, sharp and desperate. But she didn't turn back. 4 years. That house had been the center of her world. It had been where she believed her future would grow. It had been where she trusted the man she loved. Now it was simply a place that revealed the truth. Elia stopped at the corner of a street and glanced back one last time. From this distance, she could still see Robert standing near the gate. His posture had changed. The confident man she once knew looked smaller now, almost restless, pacing back and forth while the 2 officers remained calm beside him. He was still arguing, still refusing to accept the reality unfolding in front of him. But the documents would not change. The house was no longer his, and neither was the life he had planned to steal. Elia adjusted her glasses and turned away again, continuing down the sidewalk until the house disappeared behind rows of trees and passing cars. For the first time since the night she overheard Robert's conversation, the tight knot in her chest began to loosen. She was safe, and everything she had built with years of hard work was still hers. But what mattered even more was the clarity that had come from this experience. Robert had never truly loved her. He had loved the future he believed she would give him. The wealth, the property, the security. When he thought she was gone, his reaction had revealed everything she needed to know. That smile, Elia would never forget it. A quiet, satisfied smile from a man who believed his biggest obstacle had just disappeared. The memory no longer hurt as much as it once did. Now it simply felt like evidence of who Robert truly was. Elia continued walking until she reached the small cafe at the end of the block. It was a quiet place she had visited many times in the past, long before Robert had entered her life. She stepped inside and sat near the window. The afternoon sunlight poured softly across the table. For a moment, she simply watched the people outside passing by, ordinary strangers moving through their daily routines. None of them knew the strange story that had unfolded only a few streets away. None of them knew that the woman sitting by the window had technically died 3 days ago. Elia ordered a cup of coffee and sat back in her chair. Her phone vibrated lightly on the table. A message from Daniel. Transaction confirmed. All funds secured. Everything is under your control. Elia read the message twice. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Not only had the house been sold, but every financial structure connected to it had already been redirected safely into accounts that Robert could never access. She typed a short reply. "Thank you. I'll handle the rest from here." Daniel responded quickly. "Be careful, Elia. Robert will start asking questions soon." Elia stared at the message for a moment. He was right. Robert might not understand what had happened yet, but eventually he would begin looking for answers. But by then it would be too late, because the one answer he needed most was something he would never even consider. Elia was still alive. She finished her coffee slowly and stood up, leaving the cafe with a calm sense of closure. The sun had begun to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. Elia walked toward the small apartment building where she had been staying since staging the accident. It was simple and quiet, far from the luxury she had once lived in. But for now it was enough. When she reached her apartment, she closed the door behind her and leaned lightly against it. Silence filled the room. The past week had felt like a storm of decisions, disguises, and careful movements. Every step had required precision. Now, for the first time, she could finally breathe. Elia walked to the window and looked out over the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Robert was still trying to understand how his carefully planned future had collapsed. He would check the legal documents. He would speak with lawyers. He would demand explanations. And eventually, he would realize something terrifying. The person who had sold the house was the same person he believed was dead. But by the time that realization arrived, Elia would already be far beyond his reach. Her phone rang suddenly, breaking the quiet. The number on the screen made her pause. Robert. Elia stared at the phone for several seconds as it continued vibrating. He was calling her number, a number that technically belonged to a dead woman. She imagined the confusion he must be feeling now. Perhaps he had started searching through her old contacts, trying to find clues. Or maybe desperation had simply driven him to dial her number out of habit. Elia let the phone ring. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, a message appeared. Robert, if anyone is playing games with my wife's estate, I will find out. Elia read the message quietly. There was anger in those words, but also fear. She placed the phone down on the table without replying. Robert would search for answers, but the truth was something he would never expect. Because in his mind, Elia was already buried. The woman he thought he had outsmarted no longer existed. Elia walked to the small desk in the corner of the apartment and opened a folder containing the final documents Daniel had prepared. Her assets were secure. Her identity could disappear quietly for as long as she needed, and the life she once believed had been destroyed was now entirely under her control again. She closed the folder gently. Robert had tried to erase her existence. Instead, he had given her the opportunity to see the truth. And sometimes the greatest victory wasn't revenge. Sometimes it was simply walking away with everything that mattered still in your hands. Elia turned off the lights and stood near the window as the city slowly darkened. Far away, a man named Robert was still trying to understand how his perfect plan had collapsed. But the answer had always been simple. He had underestimated the woman he thought he had already killed. And that mistake had cost him everything.